Trump gets elected, not exclusively, but heavily on the promise, no more of these nonsense wars that are draining the Treasury, getting Americans killed, making America weaker globally. There's no upside at all, particularly the war in Ukraine. Donald Trump says, I'm going to do that. I'm going to bring it to a close in like the first hours after becoming president. I think he says that. And the question to you, who actually knows the answer, is how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, how you bring the war to an end, this has been on the table since before the war started. And Trump is going to have a much more difficult position now to bring that to a fruition because of the horrific decisions made by the outgoing administration. This war could easily have been avoided before it happened. The Minsk agreements, and I know a lot in the West like to say bad things about them, but the fact is that we now know Angela Merkel, Hollande, France have both admitted that that was never supposed to be implemented. They just wanted to, quote, stop Russia's invasion of the Donbass area. That's what they said that it was
Eastern
for,
Ukraine,
to buy them time, the Ukraine side time, so that they could defend against it. It wasn't to implement it. And you know that's true because one of the central provisions that was agreed to by the Russians and the French and German and the Ukrainians was that the Ukrainians would change their constitution to have political autonomy and protections for the Russian-speaking people in the East. That was one of the absolute central features of that Minsk agreement.
In the Minsk
agreements, yeah, in 2015, and it was never done. Ever. So the Ukraine side didn't implement the most important provision of it. They were also supposed to move back heavy weapons and all this kind of stuff, some of which happened. And then both sides had minor incursions over the time with artillery that was going back and forth because the Russians are going, all right, we're not going to implement our part of this all fully until you get that central part. And so they just talked about it all this time. And all we had to do is say, okay, Minsk agreements had no NATO in it. There was no NATO for Ukraine inside there. It was just resolve this situation.
It didn't address NATO.
It didn't. So it definitely didn't say that they were on the table. It didn't talk about it. So since 2008, that had been talked about by the West, that they were going to come in. But the Minsk agreement would have ended all the conflict that was on the line of contact for essentially an 8-year civil war before this one broke out. All they had to do was just implement those, and then Russia has no need to intervene because the whole issue has always been protection of the rights of the Russian people and the ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine, and the protection on their border not to have NATO in it. So if you get that off the table, now then there's plenty of room. But then by 2021, which very few Westerners are even aware of, is in March of 2021, Zelensky signs this law that says they're going to now take back all of the temporarily occupied areas, especially Crimea, which is a no-go red line for the Russians, and by force if necessary. And then,
can you possibly describe why, and lots of Biden administration officials talked about taking back Crimea. You say it's a no-go. It's not even worth discussing. Why is that? What is Crimea?
Historically, Crimea was in Russia too. I think it was. I can't remember the exact year that it was given to Ukraine by. I want to say Nikita Khrushchev. I may have that wrong. Exactly. So he gave that to them then. But it's historically, for centuries, been Russian. The vast majority
Khrushchev
of people
gave it to Ukraine when Khrushchev controlled Ukraine.
Right, when he
controlled all of the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
right.
So it was just like moving things left and right within his controlling and holdings. But the people in it were still ethnic Russians primarily. And when they had this plebiscite, like 95% of the people voted to go into Russia when after the coup that happened that unseated the legally elected government of Ukraine that Victoria Nuland and all these other people supported. Then Putin said, well, I'm certainly not going to have a NATO country around Sevastopol where I have my Black Sea Fleet. So he said, we're going to annex this thing. The people voted for it, and that's what he claimed. Now, you can disagree that was legitimate, but that's how they voted, and that's why.
Does anyone argue that the Crimeans, the residents of Crimea, if allowed to vote on it again, would vote to join Ukraine? Does anybody think that? Anyone argue that?
No one argues that because they know it wouldn't be the case. Right. And life has improved for the Crimean population since Russia annexed it. It's gotten a lot better, and it's gotten even better since the 2022 invasion because they got water back. It's one of the big things there.
Yeah.
So none of them would ever want to go back into the Ukraine side. Because
if you cared about democracy, you wouldn't try and steal Crimea from its people and give it to another government that they didn't want to join, right?
No, especially if you care about people getting to make their own decisions, which we claim to in other parts of the world, that, yes, the will of the people should rule, unless, of course, it's somebody we don't like, which goes back to the whole thing that happened in February 2014, right, when we
encouraged a coup
and then supported the overthrow of the legally elected government because we didn't like what they were doing. And we helped the actual the other people who were going against it. So everything that violated what we claimed to believe, we were supportive of at that time. And that's not democracy in any way, shape, or form.
No, of course not.
But so that's the problem, that we could have ended this war by doing the Minsk agreements. Then in late 2021, and we know this for a fact because Jens Stoltenberg has admitted this stuff very publicly, that Putin said, hey, if we don't get a deal here, we're going to use force. Jens Stoltenberg said for sure, yes.
And who was Stoltenberg?
He was the former Secretary General of NATO.
Right.
And so he has led the NATO up until just very recently when Mark Rutte took over. But he said, yes, Putin told us that, but of course we didn't sign that. We're not going to agree with that because no one can tell us who's going to join NATO. So understand at that point, and of course the United States was in complete agreement with this, that war could have been avoided by simply saying what we all knew: NATO is never going to accept Ukraine. There's no way we would ever do that. But instead of saying that, we said the opposite. They're going to come in. And so Putin says, then you've made my decision for me. We're going to take military action, which he said on December 22nd, 2021. He said, we will take military specific measures if this continues on. And certainly we know what happened on February 22nd. So we could have stopped the war from happening before. And then 2 months in, we could have stopped it again at the Istanbul. People certainly know a lot about that. Putin mentioned that when you interviewed him about a year ago. I think Sergei Lavrov even mentioned it when you talked to him about that, too. They always say we're willing to talk. Everybody has said it all the way through.
That was shut down by Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, acting on behalf of the Biden administration.
That is what we understand. And Johnson has almost never. He's kind of waffled with it, but he has said you can't talk to Putin. You can't have a negotiated settlement with him. So whether he actually did it all or was with Biden, we don't know, but we know for sure.
I tried to ask him directly, and he demanded $1 million for the interview. And I'm seeing him at the end of the month, and I hope I'll be able to interview him then.
Wow, I'll be watching that one with great interest.
I don't have $1 million in my checking account right now to pay Boris Johnson, but
but what he has said makes it very clear that that was his position. Yeah. No matter who it was, though, that did happen. So just think about it. How many Ukrainians, allegedly around a million, are dead? And probably double that, or maybe even triple that wounded. It's a staggering number. None of them should have died. All we had to do was just say what we already know: NATO's never going to invite Ukraine in, and the war would have been avoided. Absolutely, because then there's no reason for Russia to ever have invaded in the first place.
Right.
Just like if Russia was talking about, I'm hypothetically here, wanting to have missiles, say, on Cuba or so. We had a negotiation. If they had kept the missiles there, we probably would have gone to war. But we had a negotiation, and they moved them off. So if we had said no NATO coming into Ukraine at that time, then Russia had no need to do anything. They also would have backed off because it's in their interest to do so. But we didn't. So when we're talking about now, when we say no, democracy and this, unprovoked aggression, which we know wasn't true because we've admitted that it wasn't true. Now then we have what we have here. And so all of these opportunities, and by the way, there was one more in November. This is one of the worst ones in my view. In November of 2022, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said, hey, by the way, if you want to negotiate a settlement, now is the time to do it. Because remember, that was the 1 year where there were two big successes for the Ukraine army. They drove Russia out of Kherson City, and they drove them out of a huge swath of Kharkiv area in the north.
Yes.
At that time, Russia was at its weakest point. They had force mobilized 300,000 people. They were scrambling just to get uniforms in them, much less trained, et cetera, to stop the gap, to stop the bleeding up there. And the Ukraine side had every advantage. And Mark Milley publicly said, if you want to negotiate a settlement, now would be a good time. Russia's at its weakest, Ukraine's at its strongest. He goes, I'm just saying, if you wanted it, now's the time. He knew that he knew that Russia, as bad as it had been battered, was still Russia. They still had all the natural resources. that they could ever need. They had the military industrial capacity, which was already starting to gin up, and they had the manpower.
The population, exactly.
Everything that you need, and the mentality, because they view this as an existential fight. It's not like Vietnam was for us. This is on their front door, and it is an existential fight. So they will recover, and he knew that. And so if you want to negotiate from a position of strength, which he said, Milley at the time, now is the time. But no, we didn't. Zelensky was now, I think, drunk with power because he's like, we beat them here, we'll keep beating them. But militarily, Tucker, this is one of the things that's so important. Militarily, it was evident at the time that Ukraine couldn't win because Russia then, they withdrew from Kherson City, and it was talked about a humiliation for Russia at the time, but militarily, that was the wisest decision they could have made because it would have been hard to hold on to Kherson City because of the river behind them. So they moved 40,000 guys across the river, blew all the bridges so that now Ukraine can't follow that up. And so they preserved all of that manpower and all of the experience that they had, and then they ended up using them elsewhere to build a fortified defensive series of about 5 different periods, and Russia was really good at defensives. So there was every reason to think that
they've had some practice.
They have had practice, and even when I was serving during the Cold War, we studied the Russian tactics, and we knew how hard it would be. I was in an armor unit, so I knew how hard it would be to try to do an offensive against a dug-in Russian defensive line. And so when I heard in 2023 that the Ukraine was going to have this big combined arms operation going into the Russian lines, I said, there's no way that they're going to do that. I've conducted operations like that before in Desert Storm with Doug McGregor and an armored cav regiment. I knew what it was like to go into prepared enemy defenses, and that was against a not very good unit. But to go against the Russians when they had 6 months to prepare was suicide. Our leaders should have recognized that. Our Secretary of Defense should have recognized that. But instead, they said, no, we're going to succeed. We've trained them up. We've given them all these thousands of military vehicles, millions of rounds of ammunition, training, intelligence support. I think it was HIMARS at that time that we've given them already, Stingers, all kinds of stuff. And I said, look, and I wrote about this ahead of time, so this is not revisionist history. I wrote ahead of time, this will fail, and here's why. You have no Air Force. Effectively, there's no Ukrainian Air Force. You don't have enough air defense, and you don't have enough engineering support to penetrate these minefields. And the most important one is you don't have the trained manpower. It doesn't matter how many people they mobilize. I know from Armored Cav how hard it is to maneuver in coordinated fashion across a broad front. It's extremely difficult, and they had this much experience in doing that. And you can't train that up in a 2 or 3 months. No. It just can't be done. Our leaders should have known that, but instead they encouraged it. And then you had, I'll never forget this one, David Petraeus at the end of May 2023 went on the BBC and said, I think that the Ukraine side is going to do this combined arms operation, and he listed all the reasons why they're going to, and the tanks and the Bradleys and all this stuff. I think that they're going to penetrate the Russian lines, the defensive lines will crumble, crack, and maybe even collapse, and they'll go to the Azov coast. That's what he said on the eve of this thing. And, of course, it worked out the way any rational analysis would have said, was a complete disaster. It never even penetrated the first line of defense. So all of 2023 went to a predictable failure. And so now then, that was the next chance we had to end the suffering and say...
Wait, may I just ask,
sure.
You're describing the war as really a war between the United States and Russia. You're saying that these are decisions that our military leadership made or should have made. Is that
That is what I'm saying. Because the Ukrainian leadership and military, they don't have the historical experience to it. I mean, they'd only existed for 30 years.
Right.
We've got all of this stuff going all the way back to World War II, World War I. I mean, we've had all kind of institutional knowledge. And without us, nothing happens. Doesn't matter what Ukraine wants to do. Without our willingness to give the information, the ammunition, the weapon systems, all of it, and to apparently help with some of the plans, they can't do anything.
Okay, so I just don't think... I mean, thank you. Everything you're saying makes sense. I think it's obvious once you think about it, but too few do think about it. And I think a lot of people have been lulled into this idea that, there's this valiant... They may be valiant, but, Ukrainian military that's fighting this war against a foreign aggressor, Russia, and sort of leaving out the key point, which is the strategy and the munitions come from the United States. So this is a failure on the part of our military leadership as well.
100%.
Thank you.
It was such an avoidable situation. We knew better.
So when Ukraine loses, you can look at the Pentagon and say, nice job, guys, yet again.
That is exactly what I say. And very quantifiable reasons why that is. Though I will say, it's not exclusively us, because Zelensky deserves specific arguments and criticism because he continued to take these operations and actions. However much, who actually made the decisions is unclear, but he actually has a lot of a say over what they did, especially over how they employ them. And so he sent his troops to do operations that really had no chance of success. And especially, and he deserves, people claim that he's, like this modern day Winston Churchill kind of thing, right? I mean, he got all this publicity in the first. Well, Winston Churchill made some huge mistakes early in his career, and because of that...
I was just thinking about Gallipoli.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he had his Gallipoli.
I guess he is like Churchill, right?
Well, he was back then. Yeah, he's that version of Churchill. Well, good point. But he learned from those mistakes, and so he did a bunch of things right in the Second World War because he learned from his mistakes in most parts. Italy's a separate issue. That wasn't so, but is he? But he eventually did help with that. Well, Zelensky doesn't have any of that experience at all. And so he fought in this place called Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, and even Mariupol early in the war. And in every case, he stayed too long. So when his forces when it was clear that the Russian forces had moved in and into the outskirts of the city, they should have withdrawn to the next defensive line. They should have been building subsequent defensive lines knowing that the Russians were going to eventually get there. Make it as expensive as you can on every go back, and then you'll have all right, well, back here we're not going to allow penetration or we have to bring the war to an end. But instead, he just stayed there, and almost like Hitler in the end of World War II, not 1 inch. So instead of pulling his forces back, he kept them in there, and they were methodically destroyed. Now then you have to have new guys for the next city, and then they're destroyed. And you see what happens, Tucker, is that you destroy the ability to have a coherent offensive or defensive because the guys who know how to fight, who learned, die. So now then you have to bring in new guys, and it's starting from scratch again. Bakhmut was the worst because they lost probably 10,000 people to defend a city that gave them no value. They should have moved back to another area. Because here's the key. So like Bakhmut is here and it's tough to move into, but if you had moved back here where there's a lot of open land and to the next defensive position, which high ground, then it would have cost the Russians a lot more to move across this territory and they could have defended themselves better. But instead they stayed there. Then they lost thousands of men. Avdiivka, the same thing. They keep repeating the same mistake over and over. They've done it now in Toretsk. In Chasiv Yar, and they're doing the same thing. Head up on Pokrovsk in the area down there. Let's see, the one in the south there in not the Kupiansk area. The one in the south was one of the worst too because the Ukraine side held out in that town for a year and a half in Vuhledar. But then the Russians learned a lot, and so now that instead of going head on, they start flanking it, and it becomes evident you're going to lose it. But again, they would not give the order to receive. So they keep losing thousands upon thousands of trained people. So now then they're talking about lowering the age to 18 so that they can bring more people in.
They're talking about it. Actually, our incoming national security advisor is talking about it on television, whom I like. So I'm not, it's not a personal attack. But here, U.S. policymakers have completely destroyed Ukraine. They pushed this war. They started this war. I think it's very obvious that that's what happened. You just described how. And Ukraine has been devastated. The Ukrainian parliament made it legal for outsiders, non-citizens, to buy their land, so they're going to lose their country physically, and a whole generation's been destroyed. And now U.S. policymakers are saying it's your fault. You need to lower conscription age to 18. I mean, just as a Christian, I'm infuriated and repelled by that. Like, what is that? I think it's one of the most disgusting things I've ever heard.
I'll tell you what I hope is really at play here.
No, I know what you're going to say.
What?
That this is tactical. This is like trying to strike a tough pose to put the incoming administration in a better spot for negotiations.
No, I think that it is the incoming administrations to put Zelensky in a position.
Yeah,
that's to say, look, if you want to do this, you have to go and put these people in here. But you can't because this has been talked about for probably close to a year in Ukraine. Keeps getting pushed back for the reasons that you just illuminated there.
They already wrecked the country. They kill more young people.
Why would you take another generation and sacrifice them for nothing? And so people are violently against that. So he's put them in a situation, I hope.
No, you're right. But
so that Zelensky will realize then now you have to have a negotiated
settlement. How about we don't talk that way? Because it's repulsive.
Okay, I agree with you.
Sacrifice is immoral.
I agree with you. It's anguishing for me to hear. Even if it is a negotiating position, I hope it works. If that gets the war over, then okay. But I fear that they may say, okay.
Why not just say, look, I mean, why even include the Ukrainian leadership in these conversations? I don't understand. I mean, I do think we should apologize for what the Biden administration just did to Ukraine. I think that is our fault, or their fault. But I don't know why going forward why would you have Zelensky, the, Mr. Play the Piano with his dick guy? What does he have to, no, I'm serious. Like, why, he's unelected. He's not the democratically elected leader of Ukraine. There has been his term expired. He has no moral right to run that country.
Well, see, then there's more truth to that than a lot of people might realize, because Putin last month reiterated that point.
It's a fact.
Yes, we're willing to talk, but we can't sign any deal with Zelensky because he's not a legitimate leader. He's went
not
past
the president
his term.
of the country.
He's not legally the president of the country. That's right. So we said until somebody gets in there, then we can sign a deal, but we can talk to the United States right now. And so I think Trump's coming in. Trump's not going to be tied to what Zelensky does, like Biden apparently was. I mean, I can't imagine he's going to. Yeah. Because we call all the cards, and Russia says yes. America has it. I think Sergei Lavrov in the interview you had with him said the same thing. We'll talk. We're open to talk with the Trump administration. We're willing to do that. And the Biden administration could have done it at any point, and they refused to do it. And now we have the wreckage that we have.
Yeah, we do. Shadowy online tech figures are buying and selling and spying on your personal information. There are plenty of privacy services out there that help prevent your data from getting stolen. But how do you get your privacy back when it's already been taken? And that's where ExpressVPN comes in. Not only do they protect your online activity going forward, preventing anyone from seeing what you're doing, they can also remove your information from the third parties who snatched it from you. ExpressVPN is the best. We spent a lot of time looking into this company. We use it on our show every day, and it's added 3 new features. It's clearly the most effective VPN on the market. It's got data removal, ID alerts, ID theft insurance. ExpressVPN scours data broker sites and asks for your information's removal. It monitors the dark web. It tells you when anyone uses your social security number, which can happen, and it reimburses you up to $1 million for reclamation expenses if someone steals your identity, which actually happens. So these features push VPN over the edge from nice to have it to you should have it. You really need to have it. Get started with ExpressVPN for free extra months. ExpressVPN.com/Tucker, or click on the link in the description, or scan the QR code right here. So I'm sorry, I keep pulling you into just trying to tell a story and answer the question, and I keep going into cul-de-sacs as usual. But back to how this can be settled. So you just described why it's a very tough position for the incoming president. How do you end this?
Well, and I didn't describe the worst part of it yet. Because of everything we have done, and by the way, we set as an objective, Biden did on the first day of the war in his speech to the United States, and the Secretary of Defense, Austin, did so in April, was to weaken Russia. That's what we said. Ukraine must prevail. Russia must fail. I think that was the exact phrase that Biden used. And Austin said that we have to weaken Russia. That was our objective. Instead...
Why would we want to weaken Russia? Just to make it impossible for them to secure their nuclear arsenal and to make sure that some violent Muslim separatist group takes control of parts of the country? Like what? Why
because we don't like them. Just because we don't like Russia. There's too many people in power still today in Washington that grew up in the Cold War and were mourning the loss of the Soviet Union and the enemy. We should have ended NATO.
I didn't like Muammar Gaddafi, but has Libya improved since he was murdered?
Oh, Lord, yeah.
They have slave markets in Tripoli, so how's that a win for anyone? Like, who are these people? Like, how can people that stupid be in charge of anything?
Because they replicate themselves. They're the ones that are in charge, and so they don't let anybody else rise up, and even to the lower and the mid levels, unless they give in to the way people think they're. If you're not like me, forget it. If you're talking about doing something that makes sense, that doesn't mean more war, you're going to get rid of. Look at Tulsi Gabbard. They are terrified of having somebody of her quality in that position at DNI because they know she'll actually tell the truth. Yeah. She'll actually faithfully tell what the intelligence is, as opposed to just slanting it so that the president gets wrong information or slanted information that makes him think, you should go and use more military force, whatever it is. So that's why these people are still in power today. But you're right. There was no reason to want to weaken Russia. We should have wanted to end the war. And if we cared about the Ukrainian people, that's what we would have done. We would have prevented it, or at least ended it when it came in. But instead, we wanted to weaken Russia, so why not keep the war going? Because the Ukrainian people are willing to do it. Zelensky's willing to keep them going in there, even though any rational explanation could have shown the opposite. Okay, so we achieved the opposite. Russia is now much stronger than it was in February 2022. The Ukraine side is much weaker than it was. We're much weaker than we were. Just imagine, just fundamentally, how many thousands of armored vehicles have we sent to the Ukraine side? How many interceptor missiles have we sent? Almost all of our ATACMS missiles have been sent to Ukraine. We don't even have a handful left. What if we get into a war with somebody? God forbid it should be China or North Korea or even more, God forbid, if it should be Russia. What if we have to defend ourselves? We have now just eaten into our capacity to even wage war. And now then you have the Russian side has gone to the opposite side because they have now mobilized their industry. They've now expanded their army by 50% from where it started. They do have a lot of people that have gotten experience in this army and lived. And so now then their institution is growing even more capable. So that's why this is so hard for Trump, because Putin is coming in saying he's willing to talk, he's willing to have negotiations, but he sets some pretty high standards. I think when you talked to Putin in February of last year, he when you asked him what his terms were, he kind of went back. He said, well, we've already talked about this at Istanbul, so maybe something like that. Well, because we didn't take it, and then we allowed long-range weapons to be used by Americans into Russia, Putin said that deal's off the table. Now, on June 14th, he listed a new set of deal, which is all for the oblast, all of it, even the territory that Ukraine still owns. So now it's not going to be that deal before, because that would have been just the Donbass area, just the Luhansk and Donetsk. Now it's going to be bigger. But then Biden didn't accept that either. And so now then, with all the price that Russia has paid there and the strength, they don't have to negotiate. This is so important to understand. Ukraine has to negotiate to survive. We have to negotiate to get the war over. Putin doesn't. If he doesn't get the deal he wants, he'll just keep rolling until he does. And I believe that the likelihood is that they would take all the way up to the Dnieper River, even if it took another 6-9 months of fighting. I don't see any way that they're going to stop fighting here. And they've said so. They've said, we're not, Lavrov, about 3 weeks ago, said, no kind of ceasefire. We're not going to do a pause because that would just help the other side there. We're going to keep fighting, and we'll negotiate, we'll talk, but we're not going to stop fighting. So there's no ceasefire that's going to be involved because that would help the Ukraine side. So to the river, which is a considerable distance from where they are.
Yeah.
But see, here's
so how far does that put them from the capital city?
The Dnieper goes into Kiev.
I'm aware. That's why I'm asking that.
Yeah. So I think that the likelihood is that Odessa and Kharkiv cities are probably not going to remain on the western side if Trump doesn't come in and give Putin everything he wants on the first day. And I perceive, and I certainly don't know this, I haven't talked to Putin, so I don't know, but I perceive that he's set these lines here on the 14 June lines, which are all of those 4 oblasts, because there's large swaths that Ukraine still owns. It would be so hard, maybe even impossible, politically, domestically for Trump to give away areas that Ukraine hasn't lost in the war and agree to that. And so if Trump, with the Kellogg plan or whatever they try to say, they want NATO put off, or, they want the current line of contact to be the dividing line, then Russia will just say, okay, we tried to negotiate with you, we didn't. And they'll just keep going until they get to the Dnieper River, because we can't stop them. If Trump says, okay, well, I'm going to get tough and I'll give more stuff to you than Biden did. Well, first, we don't have it. But second, it doesn't matter because they don't have the manpower to use it.
We literally don't have it.
We don't. And Tucker, if Trump said, all right, well, I'm going to go in big. I'm going to take the 1st Armored Division, 1st Infantry Division, 1st Cav Division, all of that equipment, the whole set, and just give it powerful divisions that we have there, and just hand it to the Ukrainians. They don't have the manpower to use it. They would still lose just as much.
But then you also have a problem, which is this. Donald Trump just ran for office on the promise no more counterproductive wars. And so if his first act as president in office is to arm Ukraine, I don't see how that works, honestly. I can see where he would have that temptation, and I know that he's going to have that suggestion from many of his supporters, because I've been reading about him already, because I say, we got to show him he's tough. Well, not his supporters, the neocons in Washington. Yeah.
Fair point. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know
exactly
how many
what I mean.
Voters are for that, like right around zero, probably.
Yeah, they're definitely not, because they know, they can see what we're talking about here. It's nothing but a losing prospect. Why pay more to lose?
So why is it how do we get involved in this?
because of the
two
bad
guys get in
hands.
a fight down the street, and I like bankrupt my family and put their lives at risk to what?
That is exactly what we're talking about here, and it's much worse because and also we're bankrupting ourselves while we're enabling that family to die even more, and more of them. So it's immoral and irrational in my view. So, but here's the problem that Trump's political enemies here. And I've already seen it. Biden has absolutely set this up. He just said last week that I have created all this great situation here where our enemies are weaker and our friends are stronger. And I'm handing this over to Trump. You had Secretary Blinken say, you know what,
Secretary Blinken's a criminal, by the way. And if he retains his security clearance after January 20th, I'm going to, every single day, raise the alarm. I mean, there's no way that Tony Blinken should have a security clearance after Trump is inaugurated. But I know he's going to, it's super simple. Just pull Tony Blinken's security clearance. Tony Blinken is I think was running the U.S. government, hurting this country more than maybe any other single person in my lifetime. And that man deserves should be held to account for what he did.
100% agree. And his exit interview showed why. He actually told that interviewer last week that we have put Ukraine in a stronger position militarily, economically, and domestically.
Are you serious?
Oh, yeah. He said straight up, and we have them on a sustained path to continue improving. And then he said, but if Trump, comes in and they negotiate an end, that's up to them.
Those are lies. He's a liar.
100%.
And I know because I travel a lot. And last weekend, I had a meeting at, in a ski resort in the Alps, which is probably the most expensive town in the world. I was not there to ski, for the record. But the whole town is Ukrainian. All the visitors are Ukrainian, and they're rolling into Air Maze and dropping $1 million in an afternoon. Okay? So it's all through Europe you see this. The richest people are the Ukrainians. That money is ours. It belongs to me and you and every other American taxpayer. That's where it's going. Second fact, not guess, fact is the Ukrainian military is selling a huge percentage, up to half of the arms that we send them. Half. And I'm not guessing about this. I know that for a fact, okay? Not speculation. And they're selling it, and a lot of it's winding up with the drug cartels on our border. So this is a crime, what's happening. Our intel agencies are fully aware of this. You tell me they're not profiting from this. Of course, you think CIA is not profiting from this? Yes, they are. I can't prove that, but I believe that. What they don't know this, I know this, but they don't know this. They know this. And no one is saying it. Like, no American seems aware of this. We're sending these arms to Ukraine, hundreds of billions of dollars, and it's being stolen and sold to our actual enemies. Like, what the? I'm trying not to swear. What is this?
Yeah, well, the reason why is because you have Zelensky, it was about 3 weeks ago, I think, was specifically asked this question, so he went at some length in one of his interviews to say, oh, no, absolutely not. There's no truth to that at all. We've implemented all these things. I know that, but the media just reported what he said.
The New York Times could get on the web and order Ukrainian weapons. That's a fact. I'm not guessing. It's a fact. They could do that today. Like, everyone who wants to know what's going on knows, and yet they're telling me, 70,000 Ukrainians have died. 70,000? Really? You think that's the number? Everything about this is a lie. And Tony Blinken, of course, because he's running the U.S. government, knows that it's all a lie. And so for him to say that out loud is evil. Like, that's truly deceptive, I think.
Oh, and 100% it is, because it is in a direct contradiction to reality on the ground.
They're selling weapons to the drug cartels? Are you kidding? This is a nightmare. I don't understand. Why is nobody reporting? How come I know that?
Yeah, that's one of the bigger
the New York
questions.
Times doesn't know that?
Yeah, you haven't seen that report. Yeah. I mean, how could they not? I mean, the stuff is all over the place. And this has been an open secret for almost the duration of this.
Yes.
And sometimes they put a little caveat headline and then move on to whatever's next. And no one says the implication of, wait, this stuff could come back to bite us on our own border.
Well, yeah, we saw that in the 80s with the Mujahideen, of course. How are you going to have commercial air travel around the world? By the way, if their missile systems, handheld missiles, you can shoot down a commercial airliner pretty easily with a lot of this stuff. That's what it's designed to do. And if it's in the hands of separatist groups, terror groups, drug cartels, which it is,